The rain was a cold, rhythmic drumming against the clinic windows, the kind of weather that makes the world feel heavy and forgotten. Inside the quiet, sterile halls of the community health center, the fluorescent lights hummed a tired song. In the corner of the waiting room, Lily sat clutching the strap of a worn leather bag, her knuckles pale with a grip that held more than just leather. She was 22, but hardship had carved lines into her face that made her look older, her hair tied up loosely to hide the quiet pain of someone trying to stay strong for far too long. The plastic chair beneath her creaked with every small shift, but she barely moved. She was invisible by design, a girl the world had learned to look slightly to the left of. She had come for a checkup she couldn't afford. Between her fingers, crumpled and damp with anxiety, trembled a $10 bill, the full sum of her copay, the result of skipping 3 meals and walking 6 miles in the rain to save bus fare. She didn't know that the young man in the white coat who was about to walk through the door wasn't just a doctor. His name was Julian Sterling, and he had walked away from a fortune most people dream of. He had left his trajectory of private jets and gala dinners to practice medicine in the shadows of the city, where the need was invisible to those who only looked at the skyline. If you believe that kindness is the thread that connects souls and that everyone deserves a second chance, please like this video and subscribe to Pure Kindness. Today's story proves that the most powerful medicine isn't found in a bottle, but in a human heart that refuses to walk away. The nurse called Lily's name softly. She rose, her legs unsteady, and walked into the examination room as if entering a courtroom. When Julian entered, charts in hand, he didn't see just another patient. He saw the cracks near the soles of her shoes, worn down not by fashion but by endless walking. He noticed her breathing was controlled, not naturally calm, the kind of breathing a person trains into themselves when they've learned that showing disturbance is a liability. Lily was shy, her voice barely a whisper as she answered his questions. She kept her eyes down, her fingers picking at the edge of her sleeve, unraveling a loose thread that had been there longer than she could remember. Julian asked the routine questions. Any pain? Trouble sleeping? Eating well? At the last question, she hesitated. Fine, she said, but her eyes flickered with something that looked like a small animal caught in headlights. Julian noticed more than her symptoms. He saw the mismatched buttons on her coat, one blue, one gray, sewn on by a hand too tired to care about color. He saw the way she flinched when he reached for his stethoscope, as if bracing for a judgment that never came. Not a physical flinch, a tiny retreat of her shoulders, the kind of movement born of years of expecting harsh words and closed doors. He realized she was fighting a silent struggle, holding on with a quiet, desperate determination that made his chest ache. Her health was failing not because of a virus, but because of exhaustion and sacrifice. When he gently examined her, he noted the paleness of her skin, the slight tremor in her hands, the shallow breathing that came from lungs too tired to fully expand. She had been skipping meals for weeks, her body physically depleted. The numbers on the blood pressure monitor told a story of someone running on empty. Yet, she didn't complain. She apologized for taking up his time. "Why didn't you come in sooner?" Julian asked, his voice unusually soft even to his own ears. The question hung in the sterile air. Lily looked at the floor, the way children do when they've been embarrassed for something they didn't do. A single tear traced down her cheek, quick as a raindrop, and she wiped it away before it could fall from her chin. "We didn't think I deserved to be seen," she whispered, the words so faint they might have been a thought accidentally spoken aloud. Julian felt a magnetic pull in his chest, a raw human compassion he hadn't felt since he sat in a hospital waiting room years ago, reading old magazines while his own mother fought for her life. That memory surfaced now, the smell of antiseptic, the crackle of the plastic chair, the cold coffee in a styrofoam cup. He remembered the helplessness and the one nurse who had sat with him in silence, asking nothing, just being there. That nurse had saved him, not with medicine, but with presence. He knew in that moment that money can acquire almost anything, but it cannot buy the way a person looks up when they finally feel understood. Instead of rushing the appointment, instead of reaching for a prescription pad, Julian pulled a chair, an old rolling stool with a squeaky wheel, and placed it near her. He didn't sit across from her like a doctor diagnosing a condition. He sat beside her, lowering himself to her eye level. He didn't offer advice, he held space for her. He asked no more clinical questions, he simply said, "It's okay, take your time." Those 4 words, so simple, seemed to crack something open in the room. The rain outside softened to a hush, and then in halting fragments, Lily spoke. She told him she worked 3 jobs. She cleaned offices at midnight, scrubbing desks that belonged to people who didn't know her name, and bathrooms that sparkled by dawn but never held a trace of her existence. She mopped floors that never got truly dirty, just to earn enough to stay hidden from the world's demand for rent. In the early mornings, she sorted packages in a cold warehouse, and in the afternoons, she washed dishes in a diner, the steam rising around her face as she dreamed of a different life. Julian listened with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that the most important things rarely announce themselves. He discovered that Lily once had dreams. Finishing her studies, becoming a social worker, maybe writing stories that made others feel less alone. Her hands, now rough from labor, had once held pens and notebooks. "I still have my old books," she admitted, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I read them under the streetlight sometimes. It's free light." Julian's heart tightened. That image, a young woman worn down by the world, finding solace in words under a flickering bulb while the city slept, painted a mural of quiet courage he would never forget. As Lily left the clinic, she turned back once. "A thank you for listening," she said, and the words, though quiet, held the weight of someone who had not been heard in years. Julian watched her walk out into the rain, her thin coat billowing slightly, her shoulders braced against the cold. The automatic doors closed slowly, and she vanished into the gray afternoon. Julian returned to his office, but he couldn't focus. Her file was open on his desk, but it told him nothing of the soul he had just met. The feeling gnawed at him, the certainty that Lily was carrying a weight far larger than she let herself wonder about. His hands, trained to heal, felt useless. He thought of his mother again, of the people who had helped her when there was nothing to gain. He made a decision. Using his resources, connections he had left behind in the gilded world, databases he still had ethical access to, he began to search, not to invade her privacy, but to understand the burden she carried so silently. What he found stopped his breath. Lily wasn't just working 3 jobs to keep herself alive. She lived in a tiny, unheated room above a laundromat with a single window that faced a brick wall. The room had a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, and a stack of worn textbooks, but that was only the surface. Julian dug deeper, pulling county records, pharmacy receipts, hospital billing codes, threads that wove a tapestry of staggering selflessness. He discovered that Lily was using every cent of her meager wages, after rent and the barest minimum of food, to pay for the specialist medical care and medication of an elderly neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was 78, had no family left, and suffered from a chronic heart condition that required expensive monitoring. Lily had met her in the hallway one winter night when the old woman had fallen. Without hesitation, Lily had taken on the role of caregiver, advocate, and silent guardian. She took Mrs. Gable to appointments, filled her prescriptions, bought her warm blankets, and sat with her during the long nights when fear crept in. Lily had been saving for someone else's surgery while her own body screamed for nourishment and rest, but it went further. Julian discovered that Lily, with her hollow stomach, had been gathering discarded food from grocery stores, not for herself, but for motherless kids in her building. 3 children, whose mother had passed a year ago, lived with an overwhelmed aunt who worked double shifts. Lily would knock on their door, leave bags of bread and fruit and canned goods, and disappear before anyone could thank her. She fed them before she fed herself. She made sure no one around her felt the hunger she knew so intimately. She was a silent angel, moving through a world that didn't see her, stitching together lives with the last threads of her own strength. Julian leaned back in his chair, the hum of the clinic around him fading to a distant ring. Lily's sacrifice was a miracle that moved in silence, a debt she was paying forward because someone had once been kind to her when she had nothing. He learned that years ago, a teacher had bought her a winter coat and told her she mattered. That single act had rooted in her soul and grown into this forest of generosity. Now it was his turn. Julian sat for a long time staring at the rain-streaked window. He thought of the trust fund that had sat waiting for him, the investments that had multiplied while he slept, the mansion that stood empty because he preferred a modest apartment near the clinic. He had walked away from the life of a millionaire heir, but he hadn't walked away from the money itself. It was still there, a tool he had never quite known how to use. Until now, he made calls. He called the hospital billing department and paid off Mrs. Gable's medical debts in full, thousands of dollars of past due accounts that had been accruing interest and threatening collections. He did it anonymously, using a foundation name that held no trace of his identity. Then he called a contractor and arranged for the unheated room to be made warm, for the window to be replaced, for new bedding to arrive without explanation. He didn't stop there. Julian reached out to the university Lily had once dreamed of attending. He established a scholarship, not in his name, but in hers, the Lily Scholarship for students who had overcome hardship and served others without recognition. He contacted the diner where she washed dishes and asked the owner to give her a raise, with the difference to be covered by an anonymous donor. He coordinated with the aunt of the 3 children and set up a weekly grocery delivery, enough for healthy meals, enough so Lily wouldn't have to scavenge anymore. But he knew that help, when wielded carelessly, can feel like charity and sting like pity. So Julian decided to return to Lily, not as a millionaire, but as a friend. He waited a few days, then invited her back to the clinic under the pretense of a follow-up. When she arrived, she looked slightly better. There was a flicker of color in her cheeks, perhaps from the food she had allowed herself to eat, thinking it was a gift from a neighbor. In the same small examination room, Julian sat beside her again. He spoke gently. Lily, I know about Mrs. Gable. I know about the children. I know you've been holding up the sky with your bare hands. Her face went pale, then flushed. For a moment she looked terrified, as if someone had stripped away the armor of invisibility. "I didn't mean to," she started, but Julian raised a hand. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "What you've done is the bravest thing I've ever witnessed, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." He told her about the debts cleared, the scholarships, the warmth coming to her room. He told her that none of it came from him in a way that expected gratitude. It came from the universe, he said, because the universe sometimes listens when someone has given more than they ever should. Real talent doesn't need a certificate to prove itself, he added, but the world needs to see yours. Lily looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears that reflected the harsh ceiling lights like tiny stars. She didn't know he was a millionaire. She only saw a doctor who had listened. And in that moment, the walls she had built around her heart, brick by lonely brick, began to crumble. Over the following weeks, Julian walked with Lily through the transformation. He introduced her to a counselor who specialized in trauma and self-worth, paying for sessions without ever mentioning the cost. He connected her with a mentor at the university, a professor of social work who had herself overcome poverty. Lily began taking classes again, at first tentatively, then with a hunger that wasn't for food but for knowledge. She discovered a passion for psychology, for understanding the invisible wounds people carry. She poured her story into essays that made her professors pause and read twice. But the healing wasn't just for Lily. Julian realized that he had been a different kind of broken. Despite all his resources, he had felt adrift, disconnected from purpose. Working in the community clinic had been a start, but he had kept a wall around himself, a professional distance that prevented true connection. Lily, with her quiet radiance, had breached that wall without ever trying. Through this small act of bravery, his choice to see her, to hear her, to intervene, Julian found his way back to being a man of integrity. He discovered that the greatest architecture isn't made of steel, but of the strength found in a human heart. He began to spend more time with Mrs. Gable, visiting her on weekends, bringing her books, listening to her stories of a life fully lived and now quiet. The elderly woman's eyes, which had once held only isolation, now sparkled with gratitude. She called Lily a "my angel of mercy," and Lily, who had stopped being afraid to smile, would blush and hold Mrs. Gable's hand. Lily and Julian developed a friendship built on shared silence and hard-won trust. They would walk in the park, not needing to fill every moment with words. She learned about his mother, about the years of illness and the eventual loss that had shaped him. He learned about her childhood, the foster homes, the hunger that never quite left her memory. They realized that kindness isn't a betrayal of our pain, it's a way of honoring the love we still have to give. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of amber and rose, Lily turned to Julian on a park bench. "A warrior could think I was invisible," she said, her voice steady now, no longer a whisper. "But you saw me." "Why?" Julian looked at her, the question pulling at something deep. "Because you reminded me of someone I lost," he admitted, "and because seeing you meant seeing myself again." In that exchange, no romantic confession was needed. They had found something rarer, a recognition of souls that had both been searching for meaning in a world that too often looks away. Years passed, and the ripples of that one rainy afternoon grew into waves. Lily completed her degree with honors, then pursued a master's in social work. She specialized in community health, bridging the gap between medicine and human dignity. She became the director of a nonprofit organization that Julian had quietly funded, a foundation for the unseen, dedicated to supporting invisible caregivers like the woman she once was. The foundation provided medical debt relief, emergency housing, warm meals, and educational grants to people who sacrificed everything for others but never asked for help themselves. Julian continued to practice medicine, but he also became an advocate for systemic change, using his wealth and influence to lobby for policies that protected the vulnerable. He never sought recognition. He kept his name off the foundation, letting Lily's story be the beacon. The clinic where they met expanded its services, offering free counseling and nutrition programs. The wall where Lily once waited in the corner now bore a mural, a tree with deep roots and spreading branches, each leaf painted by a child from the neighborhood, a testament to the strength found in hidden places. Mrs. Gable lived many more years, her heart condition managed, her last chapter filled with laughter, tea parties with the children Lily had fed, and the comfort of knowing she was loved. When she eventually passed, it was peacefully, with Lily and Julian at her side. Her final words were, "Tell the world that kindness is the only thing that endures." The three motherless kids grew up knowing they were never forgotten. One became a chef, inspired by the food that appeared on their doorstep. One became a teacher, the youngest a nurse. They all remembered the quiet girl with the worn bag who had fed them when they had nothing. They called her their guardian angel, never realizing that she had once felt invisible herself. Standing at the foundation's 5th anniversary, Lily addressed a crowd of donors, volunteers, and the very people the foundation had lifted. She was no longer the young woman in mismatched buttons and cracked shoes. She stood tall, her eyes bright, her voice clear and resonant. "Used to believe that I didn't deserve to be seen," she said into the microphone, the hush of the room a familiar blanket. "I thought my struggles were a sign of my worthlessness. But someone saw me, not my poverty, not my exhaustion, but me. One person sat beside me in an exam room and treated me not as a patient, but as a human being. That moment rewired my soul. It taught me that seeing someone, truly seeing them, is an act of creation. When you create a world around them where they are not alone." Julian sat in the second row, no white coat, just a simple sweater. He watched her with eyes that held both pride and humility. He had finally understood that his wealth was never the point. It was the tool, not the healer, The real medicine was the choice to stay, to listen, to act. After the speech, as the crowd mingled under strings of warm light, Lily found Julian. They stood together without words, watching people embrace, share stories, and laugh. "You changed everything," Lily said quietly. Julian shook his head. "Oh, but you changed me first." They both knew the truth. They had saved each other. In a world that often feels cold, they had kindled a flame that would never go out. Sometimes the people we pass without seeing are the ones holding the world together. If this story of pure kindness touched your heart and reminded you that goodness still lives among us, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to believe in hope again. Subscribe to Pure Kindness and tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed a silent hero who gave their last to help a stranger? Share your story below. We are listening. Remember, one simple act of compassion can heal the deepest wounds. Let's keep humanity alive, one story at a time.